Today's episode of the Old Souls Football Podcast, we're going over one of the greatest to ever do it. That's Vince Lombardi, legendary coach of the Packers in the 1960s. Goes to the Redskins. A lot of what-ifs for his 1969 season. Neil and I dive in next. 1969. Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to step foot on the surface of the moon. That was actually kind of the first live TV event.
Yes, I suppose the first, except I guess maybe the Kennedy era. Of course, he wasn't assassinated on live TV, but the immediate reaction, like the Walter Cronkite stuff.
Yeah, people tuned into that, and there was breaking news and all of that. But I think it was the first live TV event where people predetermined programming.
Yes.
It was appointment television. It's kind of a preview for where the NFL is headed in 1969. Kind of gives you a picture of where we are in time. Some other events from 1969. Gaddafi rises to power in Libya. Ho Chi Minh actually dies while the Vietnam War rages on in the South Pacific. And I guess not the South Pacific, but Southeast Asia.
Was that the year of the My Lai Massacre, 1969, or was that 68?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I didn't look that up. I just was looking for some stats on 1969, but you could be right. But obviously, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War, which is a huge talking point. Politics are kind of changing in the United States as well. People's approach and philosophies on everything, not just politics, but coaching.
Life in general.
Life, sports, culture, everything. Everything's changing. And 1969 and really the 1960s are kind of that turning point. But going back to football, the AFL has a massive victory that January as the Jets beat the Colts in Super Bowl III. That became one of the most influential events and what led to that merger in 1970.
It was the catalyst, truly, probably, for it. It was when the NFL realized, though they didn't want to admit it, okay, well, the AFL is getting some good players. Maybe we want in on some of that.
Yeah, and I've thought about this before, but what happens if the Colts do what they were expected to do
and roll them?
Let's say Shula and Earl Morrall and the Colts come into Miami and beat the Jets by 20. They were 19.5-point favorites, I believe. So I think that's the biggest spread in Super Bowl history. If that's 3 straight Super Bowls where the Packers destroy the Chiefs by 25, and then they beat the Raiders 33-14, and the following year the Colts blow out the Jets, is there a merger the way we saw it? Or is it more of a, they absorb the best AFL teams and there's
that's kind of what I was thinking. Maybe a team like the Jets, they kind of dissolve and the Giants retake over being the big brother. Because there was a time there that the Jets had the upper hand for a good 15, 20 years until the Giants did eventually come up in the mid 80s. But I'd say, they probably, you would think maybe they take Kansas City and the Raiders and who knows? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think that was a really big turning point. We could probably do an episode just on Super Bowl III.
Yeah.
But a couple other notes on that game. The quarterback actually for the Colts wasn't Unitas, who was kind of the quarterback of the decade, really the 50s and the 60s. He led Baltimore to Earl Morrall, led Baltimore to a 13-1 season. He won MVP that year, and he was a backup for the defending MVP, Johnny Unitas. So if Baltimore wins that Super Bowl, I mean, you got to keep Morrall, right?
Yeah.
You got to keep him starting. But they didn't do that.
In fact, Earl Morrall might be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? I mean, he had, because don't forget, he was also the main starting quarterback for the 1972 Dolphins because Bob Greasy went down the third game of that season and he had to come to the rescue and take them the rest of the way.
Yeah. And, you spoke about Miami, but I mean, does he even go to Miami if they stick with Morrall? Because Unitas was kind of at the end of his career at that point anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, my thoughts, like that game really kind of set the stage for the 1970s. But really the thing that set the stage the most from the transition to from the 60s to the 1970s was when Vince Lombardi leaves Green Bay and becomes head coach and general manager of the Redskins.
Yeah.
Because Lombardi, he was kind of the figurehead, like the number one face of pro football in the 60s. And rightfully so. He had quite the resume. To kind of go into Lombardi's background, he was one of the 7 blocks of granite at Fordham, which I believe was, I guess, created by Grantland Rice. So back
Oh.
then, in like the 1930s, if you were like one of the 4 horsemen at Notre Dame, that was a Grantland Rice piece. Like if you were kind of coined, if you became
Oh.
kind of
Oh,
a
I see what you're saying.
yeah, if you became a figurehead of Grantland Rice, like Lombardi was famous as a player, is what I'm saying. It
Okay.
wasn't
Wow.
he wasn't just a pro football coach figurehead. Like this guy was a bona fide stud as a
Yeah.
player. But back then, like pro football was nowhere near it is now. Like,
Yeah, the college game ruled the real honestly the first 75 to 100 years of American football in this country.
yeah. Well, and back then, like the number one role, I mean, the number one players in the country, like as high school recruits, were going to the service academies because
Yeah.
the culture back then and pro football and like that wasn't really a career. The best line these guys could go, career path I guess these guys could follow was joining the military. So a lot of
Yeah.
them would go to the army, and like West Point was dominant in those days. And after
Honestly, that's how like the likes of Notre Dame rose to power because the even though ironically Lombardi himself was a Catholic, but a lot of the Catholic kids weren't getting into the big WASP universities,
yeah,
um, whether they were military academies or just like Ivy League schools. So they were going to Notre Dame and like they were hoarding all like the great Catholic talent in like the New England area and the
yeah,
Chicago area, Philadelphia.
yeah, and Lombardi had the Catholic thing almost working against him, and he always also, he was famous for always saying that he didn't think he got a really a head coaching opportunity until later in his life, which mid 40s back then, that was pretty late in life
Yeah.
for a football opportunity like what he got with the Packers. And he blamed it a lot on his Italian heritage. And
Yeah.
that I think he was quoted as saying like his last name ended with a vowel, and that was why he wasn't getting opportunities, in the early 1950s or even the
Yeah.
mid 1950s. And it took him so much success with West Point and with the Giants. But speaking of West Point, about 10 years after his playing days he ends up kind of linking up with Colonel Red Blake. If you want to understand college football, you got to read up on these Army teams from the 1930s and 40s. Heisman Trophy winners, national champions in the 40s. And it kind of gives you a complete cultural perspective on where we were as a country at that point, like we just talked about, where the academies and these Ivy League schools, they're getting the best players. We kind of hit a turning point later on, but Lombardi, when he got that job at West Point, that was a great gig. That's like getting in today's world, that's like getting an offensive coordinator job in the SEC.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, he goes to West Point. He's part of that, he's part of that. And then after 5 years at West Point, he leaves to become what basically was the offensive coordinator job with the Giants under head coach Jim Lee Howell. So this coaching staff that he joins, by the way, like I just want to ask this question. Is this the best like offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator tandem of all time? Your
Yeah.
offensive coordinator is Vince Lombardi. Your defensive coordinator is Tom Landry.
I mean, that's as good as it gets there. Do you know what's kind of funny about that? Just thinking about it, isn't it hilarious? Now the Giants, they have nobody should feel sympathetic for them at all because they have 4 Super Bowls of their own.
Yep.
But isn't it funny that the Giants it might have had some of the best coordinators in NFL history, and they
Yeah.
all left to have success elsewhere.
Yeah. Bill
More
Belichick.
success than they had in New York.
I mean, don't forget John Fox. I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
and hey, Sean Payton was the
Yeah.
offensive coordinator for those
Yeah.
teams too.
Well, I mean, I make that John Fox joke, but he was actually a pretty good coach. He did get a team to the Super Bowl. So,
Steve Spagnuolo is about to win his third Super Bowl. Well, he might,
yeah.
and
And
he was.
Spags has always been like a great coordinator,
Yeah, he
not a
was just
great
not a
head
good
coach.
Yeah, he was with the Rams as a head coach, right? If I want to
He
say,
was.
yeah.
But that, I mean, I think, talking about coaching success though, if you don't have the quarterback,
No,
it doesn't matter. Like we just saw that with Belichick. You know, you have a quarterback go out there and turn it over every other series, you'll never win.
yeah.
I
And
mean,
it's really an unfortunate price that great coaches have to pay. Like I think we mentioned last week on the show that Joe Gibbs, when we were talking about Drew Brees, Joe Gibbs is really the only coach that consistently won with like middle tier quarterbacks his entire career.
yeah,
It's not easy, and today's world of big flashy stats and highlights, the coaches can't get on the field, and it's hard to fault them when their players suck, and yeah, they do play a part in that, for in terms of how those players were acquired, if they had a say in it, or and how they were developed or anything like that. But yeah, no, I totally agree. It's a quarterback's game, and the head coach unfortunately falls victim to that more than the
yeah,
quarterback does, I think.
yeah, for sure. But going back to the Giants, offensive coordinator Vince Lombardi, defensive coordinator Tom Landry. That's a combined. Let me look here. Sorry, I had it written down. That's a combined 7 league championships between two
Yeah.
coordinators on that team who all wanted somewhere else.
And four of the first 10 Super Bowls, 11 Super Bowls.
Yep.
Ugh.
And they win the 1956 NFL championship, and then they return to the championship game in
Against the
1958.
Bears.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think that was Bears were 56, and then in 1958 they beat the Colts, or they lose to the Colts, excuse me,
Yeah.
in what is known as the greatest game ever played. Uh,
Yeah.
that was the first sudden death overtime game in league history. Um, and you could even argue for the NFL, that was kind of the turning point where this sport became the number one sport in America and not baseball.
Yeah.
Because I think people realized the excitement, and it was like appointment television that you had to tune in. Like every down you watched felt important, where baseball doesn't necessarily have that pace,
Yeah.
in a June setting, right?
Could you imagine? We had somebody on that followed us on one of our non-porn bot followers on Twitter that
Yes.
it was a great question. And I've honestly never thought about it before, but they said, what would be a game you would have loved to have gone back and watched in real time? And me and you both picked games that the Bears and Packers played in, but
Yeah.
that 58 championship game, not maybe to, well, obviously to be at the Polo Grounds to see it, but, or was the Polo
Was it
Grounds
Yankee?
that
I
game
think it was
was,
Yankee Stadium.
oh, maybe it was because that's where the Giants
Yeah.
played, was Yankee Stadium. But it might have even been better to be sitting in a living room in Chicago, Illinois, or South Carolina, and watching that and feeling the energy of, like, because people knew how football was played, but they never saw it played that good at that level. And that, I mean, that would have been, that might be my answer to that question now. That would have been an amazing moment to see that.
Yeah. And I mean, because that was right where the game started being telecast on television.
Hmm.
And I think like the precursor to the question was like games that you couldn't see. So that's why I chose a game from the 30s, because like
Yeah.
television really wasn't a thing yet.
Hmm.
But I agree with you. I would love to go back in time, to be in person for the first sudden death game in history.
Yeah.
Uh, Lombardi ends up finally landing a coaching gig, and it took him till age 45, and there was a lot of speculation on why it took so long. Lombardi, I think, kind of quoted that, or was quoted as saying that it was because he was Italian. His last name ended with a vowel. Some of it, I think, was his temperament, and some of it was, I think, the expectations he had in terms of what he wanted. I think he chose the perfect spot for him in Green Bay. So in 1958, Philly actually had an opening, but the ownership group in Philadelphia was like split among like dozens of different businessmen in the area, and they were never going to give up full control, right? There's too many cooks in the kitchen per se, right? And this is, football is not an industry at this point, right? It's still a bunch of local car dealers essentially pulling together their money, and they want to run a football team, kind of like the local, American Legion or something, right?
Yeah.
It didn't work that way. It doesn't work that way now like it did in the 50s. I think Lombardi wanted to go in and really control the process because he wanted to create his own culture, his own environment, right? And really the only job that you could get that control was a team that was complete dog crap. That was the Green Bay Packers of the
Yeah.
1950s. Green Bay, I think, was so bad that Lombardi's wife, Marie, actually pleaded with Wellington Mara to enforce Lombardi's contract to keep him in to keep him on as an assistant. Remember, he would be the head coach and the GM, like give every football piece of football control he wanted in his career was in Green Bay. She did not want to go to Green Bay because, location wise, if you're used to New York, think of the opposite is in Green Bay.
Yeah.
It,
Farmland.
and back
Nothing.
then, yeah, and back then Lombardi had ever really known the New York area. Fordham, West Point, the Giants, they're all within
Yeah.
driving distance, an easy commute for somebody that grew up in the city. So he goes to the Packers. Like I said, they're the worst team during the 1950s. No winning seasons throughout the entire decade. So you're talking like Cleveland Browns 2010s level
Oh,
incompetence. Like it's a bad spot. And they only had one win in 1958. And that was actually over those Eagles that we just mentioned, who only won two games. So this Packers team, they're not getting a lot of results on the field. But despite those results, the Packers actually drafted incredibly well in the 1950s. I was looking through their drafts, and they're amazing. So they have this one scout on staff. So think about this for a second too. Like in the 2000s, or I guess we're in the 2020s now, like NFL teams have probably a dozen scouts at least working for, like regional scouts, and then you have like pro personnel people all the way up to the GM. Their front office is probably like at least 20, 30 people,
yeah.
right? They had one guy really picking the players because this
Jack,
is the
a
fit.
jack of all trades.
Yeah, jack of all trades, Jack Venisi, head scout of the Packers pretty much throughout the entire 50s. Was the only guy on the staff, but he happened to draft 7 Hall of Famers.
Oh,
So
Jesus.
7 Hall of Famers.
Holy
And I can
Christ.
pull them up. I didn't write them all down. But the greatest draft of all time is actually the 1958 class, I think, where he drafted Jim Taylor in the second
Wait,
round,
wait. Oh, go on, go on, go on. Finish up.
Ray Nitschke in round 3,
Okay.
and Jerry Kramer round 4. He got 3 Hall of Famers in the within like I guess within 3 picks, or I guess within the first 4 picks of the 1958 draft. Like think about trying to do that today. That's like nearly impossible.
Congratulations, Jack Venezi. No, in
Vinny,
all Venezi, yeah. In all due respect, um, that is really great. I mean, that's unbelievable. However, the greatest draft of all time was definitely the 1974 Steelers. Like they drafted 5 Hall of Famers in one draft. And like he drafted 3 in the first 4 rounds. They drafted 4 in the first 5 rounds. They had Lynn Swan from USC. They had Jack Lambert, who was like a MAC linebacker, I think. They got John Stallworth. They got Mike Webster, who before he became a crazy man. And then this is like back in the day when there was like 450 draft picks. So imagine being an undrafted free agent and making the Hall of Fame. Donnie Shell, he was a safety for the Steelers back in the 70s. I think the 58, 59 Packers, that might be up there.
It was the
The
58 draft. And funny
58
enough,
draft.
the season they went 1-10, and 1-10-1 was the season they drafted 3 Hall of Famers in that year's draft, which shows like number one, rookies really didn't matter back then,
Oh
and then number
no.
two, players didn't mean everything. It wasn't just about acquiring talent. You needed a coach.
Yeah. That's the
And
truth.
but I came away thinking this, like when I studied Vinisi specifically and like the team he had built, I guess the roster he had built, there's really zero doubt to me that Jack Vinisi is one of the greatest talent evaluators of all time. Now, you can obviously put him up
Yeah.
there with some of the GMs from the 70s, like you said, but the Steelers, the 49ers, pro personnel people. We talked about Bobby Beathard last week.
Yeah.
But this is a guy that died over 60 years ago, and he's still
Yeah.
not in the Hall of Fame. It's long overdue.
And in fairness, like as you said, he did this on his own. He was doing this, even in the 70s, like there was better ways of collecting data on players that, obviously not the type of stuff we have nowadays, but it was certainly easier, and they would have had a larger swath of an army of guys, at least a few guys, to go out and do
Yeah.
the scouting. Him doing this on his own and getting 3 Hall of Famers, I mean, that quickly in one draft, it is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, because I think so. And that wasn't his only great draft. So in the 1958 Packers draft, I mentioned you had Jim Taylor round 2, Ray Nitschke round uh, round 3, and Jerry Kramer round 4. Like that's a great draft by itself. But I mean,
Mhm.
you have guys like Jim Ringo that he drafted. He drafted Bart Starr with pick 199. I mean, he's finding guys every single season. I mean, he drafted Paul Hornung. Like, when you look at his resume, there's zero doubt to me that that's a Hall of Fame resume.
Yeah.
And I think the issue that he ran into is I think he was just kind of forgotten in time because he dies right before the glory years of the 60s Packers. And I think that's what ended up
Oh, he
happening.
did really.
Yeah, he died in
How did?
1960.
Oh, wow.
He just died of a heart attack.
No
So
shit.
he never really saw, I think he even died before the 1960 championship. So
Wow.
he never even saw the team make a championship, nonetheless, not even win one. So that was one of the tragedies. Is he dies, I think, at like age 34. So he doesn't even see, like I said, he doesn't see all the players that he collected over the 1950s. He doesn't really even see them win. And
So
Lombardi, or go ahead.
no, just related because the name Venezi, it started making me think for a second because the Bears had an executive that worked for obviously in their front office. He was their GM, and Jerry Venezi, he was the youngest brother of Jack.
Yeah. I
So
think and I
that's
think
crazy.
I did a little research on Jack because the episode's not on Jack, but I believe he came from Chicago or came recommended from George
Yeah,
Hallis.
he's from Chicago. Yeah,
Yeah. So I think
wild.
like George, and we'll get into George Hallis in a second, but like or later in the episode, but you talk about a rival coach doing a lot of favors to keep the team
I
alive.
know. He should
I
have just
mean,
let them die. I'd be a
I mean,
happier man today.
yeah. Well, I mean, they would just be the Milwaukee Packers, but
Yeah.
yeah. So But anyway, so despite all that great scouting in the 1950s, so we talk about Jack Venisi, like Hall of Fame resume, the fact that he's not in right now is a joke. The Packers stunk in the 50s. Like I said, they won, very few games, no winning seasons until Lombardi gets there in 59. Uh, Scooter McLean, the head coach in 58, was known as this nice guy, but not someone that commanded respect. And that's not necessarily a good guy to be leading your team when like the figureheads of your team are guys like Paul Hornung, guys like, Max McGee, kind of party
Yeah.
boys, playboys. I mean, there's so many stories about those two. You could do a whole episode just on that if you wanted. That'd be like an X-rated episode. But he'd play poker with these guys. He'd owe them money, which
Oh,
is probably not a good place to be if you're
oh my God.
commanding guys to do their jobs. Uh, they really lacked discipline. They were a mess on the field, and I think my biggest takeaway looking at the 50s Packers, like we just talked about it, talent everywhere. I mean, coaching, talent's everywhere on this field, right? When you look at these, but there's not a lot of wins. They're missing a vital piece, and that's the coach. That's the culture that you're trying to build. They had no culture. They had a losing culture, even with all these Hall of Famers that are on the team. And I hear it every year. Who won the draft? Who won the draft? And I feel like every year we hype up the same teams, like the Chargers won the
Yeah.
draft. And every damn year they go 7-9
Yeah.
because they don't think sometimes that like you can draft a bunch of guys that are uber talented or like great at their positions, but if you never think about like the way of building a team and building a winning mindset, like
Right.
you're never gonna get there. And like I think it's more extreme, or was more extreme in the 50s. I mean, I don't think Brandon Staley was out playing poker with the boys or anything like that.
Right.
But it does kind of teach you a lesson that, you know, leadership still matters in a game that we care so much about who runs the fast 40 in their underwear.
Right.
And we're so data driven now with the way we look at things, but you're still leading a group of men into an organized event. And if they're not led to do things the right way all the time, they're going to lose. So Lombardi's whole philosophy is the perfect fit. You have talent all over the field, and what you really need is this basically a West Point instructor to come in and teach discipline. His whole philosophy is centered around teamwork, perseverance, work ethic, like I said, discipline. He wants all his players to just execute the simple things all the time and do them perfectly, even though you're never going to. I mean, he'd always say, you're not going to ever get to perfection, but if you keep chasing perfection, you'll find excellence. And that was kind of his whole philosophy. And, that would, that the Packers sweep, I think, is like the number one example of this philosophy, where in the Packers sweep is basically the most famous play in football history, where outside of like, well, I guess the T formation is more of a formation, but like
Yeah. There's
the
a system.
actual, yeah, the play itself is the Packer sweep. He moved actually Paul Hornung, who was a quarterback in Notre Dame. He moved him to halfback, and then the center, it was usually Jim Ringo, or later on it was Bill Curry. You know, they had to cut the defensive tackle or the linebacker off from the play, which is a really hard block to make. Because ask any inside offensive line, that's not an easy job to do, to cut them out of a play
Giving up
completely.
your body.
Yeah, I mean, basically every single time that has to suck. Uh, the guard on the near side of the play would have to vacate his gap and basically pull the lead ball carrier. And then on the far side would have kind of, I would say, not the most difficult block like the center, but the far side guard would then have to basically pull to act as a lead blocker for the halfback. So basically it's a play that it's not super complicated, but it takes execution at a perfect level, and it takes a lot of rhythm, and you just have to do it over and over and over. And that's what Lombardi did. He just drilled this play constantly in practice. They ran this play so much, teams knew it was coming. Like they would basically like they're going to run the sweep,
Set
and it
up
was still
guys.
effective. It didn't matter. This play was so effective. Think about it for the era that we're in, by the way. This is known as the dead ball era.
Hmm.
Explosive plays weren't necessarily a normal thing. It's not like today's game. This play was estimated, they didn't keep the stats exactly, but most estimates say from 1959 to 1961, the Packers sweep averaged 8 yards per carry.
Oh my God.
So this is just, and it's perfect for the era because you're just controlling the ball, you're moving it down the field consistently,
Hmm.
and you're milking the clock, which is in that era, that's what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
Team defenses couldn't stop this. And one of these things, the Packers sweep really made me think about it because think about it. Like we make fun of Matt Nagy, right? For his play sheet. How transferable is Lombardi's philosophy where like he comes in and he's not running that many plays, but it's more about how well you execute the few plays that you have. How would that work well in today's game where guys are more known for having these elaborate schemes? And what is the quote that I always hate hearing? He's a great football mind.
Yeah.
And like we're some like these guys are scientists or something drawing up plays.
Yeah. It's hard to say because even like on a high school level, like teams still have, a couple hundred plays at their disposal and they're calling plays from the line of scrimmage. It's the idea of only having a handful of plays in unless it's youth football. But even back then it was probably not that common I'm sure teams had more than, I'm sure Green Bay had the smallest playbook in the NFL even then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily, and I don't want to necessarily, make Lombardi seem like he ran like five plays,
No,
but
no, but
yeah,
yeah, they
the
had
the
a
the
much more condensed
yeah.
set that they were looking at.
So he went, I think Scooter McLean, I think they said like had a playbook that was like 5 inches thick, right? And I think the book When Pride Still Mattered by David Marinus, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. So Scooter McLean apparently had a 5 inch playbook, and Lombardi's was like maybe an inch and a half thick,
Hmm.
full of plays. And this is offense and defense, of course.
Yeah,
But the whole idea is the emphasis is on execution and making every play you do excellent instead of focusing in on how many things can we confuse a defense or confuse an offense with. And it made me think a lot about like the Dom Capers era with the Packers, like where they were blitzing so much in like the 2011 season, their defense was so bad. Where I feel like there were so many broken plays because guys weren't where they should be all the time. And like, well, yeah, because you're running this crazy scheme.
yeah,
Meanwhile, Lovey Smith never really ever had a bad defense with Chicago, and they're running Tampa 2 every play.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. That's true. Yeah, they had the dogs to do it.
yeah, it's about players. It's about finding the players that will execute every single time. And football at its core is a game of leverage. It's a game of pad level. And God, I sound like such a meathead for saying that,
I
but it's true. It's true. And I think Lombardi obviously would have to evolve a little bit more with the pass game, like because
yeah,
he wouldn't be coaching in the dead ball era. But I mean, the core philosophy is still the same. Like if you can, if your team, if the 11 guys you have on the field can all execute and do their job, well, and you can teach that to it at its core, you're going to win.
Yeah.
And I think the guy that looks like Lombardi in today's game, which I guess he's no longer in today's game, is Bill Belichick.
Yeah. The
That's
closest
who I
thing.
think of. But Lombardi had success, obviously, in Green Bay. Breaking news: 9 seasons in Green Bay, 89, 29, and 4.
Oh my God.
That's a
Holy
70 or
God.
0.754 win percentage, which is the greatest of all time from a coach that appeared in over 100 games. 9-1 in the postseason.
Oh,
That's never going to happen again, by the way.
no.
No one's ever going to do that.
Oh, who was their one loss to?
The 1960 Eagles in the championship game.
Oh, so the first one, the first
Yeah.
playoff game he was in, basically.
Yeah. He went 9-0 to finish his playoff career.
Oh yeah, he made up for that.
I think he
I
told his
forgot
team
that.
I think he told his team after the game, we're never going to lose again. And he was right. They
Yeah,
didn't.
he nailed that.
The dude was a boss, and people respected the man. Like, what he said came true. I think a lot of people resented him because he was kind of a hard ass. But look at the fucking results.
Yeah.
They're there. I mean, you're never gonna see 9-1 from any coach ever. Bill Belichick doesn't touch that. I
Didn't
mean,
you tell me that there's only like one other coach? Oh no, it was active coaches. That's right. But
yeah,
it was Zach Taylor and like
yeah,
who's the weirdest person to include
yeah.
in the stat that Vince Lombardi might be part of.
Well, so Lombardi's in the 900 club, right? So the
Yeah.
900 club is the
There's nobody else in that club, right?
no. Lombardi's by
I
far
wouldn't
the
even say
best.
if there's anybody in the eight, maybe not
I
even
don't
Chuck Noll.
I don't think Chuck Noll's not in the 800 club. And
Holy.
the 700 club, which is also I think a Christian talk show. The 700 club is I believe Zach Taylor. Kyle Shanahan's in it now.
Oh, is he?
And
For
Bill
now?
Belichick. I'd have to do the math, but I think
Yeah.
Kyle Shanahan, since he beat Green Bay and Detroit just in the
Oh,
last couple
yeah.
of
He might.
games, I think Kyle Shanahan's had a lot of postseason success. And we can do this next episode when we're talking more about Hall of Fame. But I mean, if Kyle wins the Super
That's a
Bowl,
preview for next week, everybody.
yeah, Kyle Shanahan, if he wins this Super Bowl, which we will know the answer to next Tuesday,
Yep.
I mean, I think he's starting to get close to where he's going to be in that conversation if he just decided to retire like after the Super Bowl or something. I
Yeah.
think he might have enough of an argument because he's been that dominant in the postseason. Like, you don't see that level of success plus a Super Bowl. But the point being, Lombardi really untouchable. And it almost gives him this like mythological lore. Like, in January, I guess back then it was December. Most of the postseason was in December. But in December football, like, you didn't beat the Packers in the
Yeah.
60s. You just didn't. Like, so they beat the Giants in 61 and 62. They beat the Browns in 65 to win the pre-Super Bowl NFL championships.
Still
And
counts.
we're gonna set the record straight right now for everybody that listens. A pre-merger NFL or AFL championship
Yeah.
counts just as much as a Super Bowl on this
Yes.
podcast. Like,
So don't come back at us like, well, they only won four or he only won two Super Bowls. Shut the hell up.
no. You and by the way, and like especially when it comes to Lombardi, they win in 66 and 67. They beat Dallas in the NFL championship. They beat the shit out of Kansas City and Oklahoma or in Oakland. They beat
Yeah.
the shit out of them. I said Oklahoma. They beat the shit out of Kansas City and Oakland in the first two Super Bowls. They declared themselves in that game. They were the most dominant team in pro football in the 1960s. There was no
Yeah.
better team. And they
There's
did
nobody
it.
else on the mountaintop with them.
They won 5 championships in 7 seasons. Like, I don't think that'll ever be. I don't think that'll ever be matched
No.
in the game ever again. Like that's Boston Celtics level success. Like with when they had like Red Auerbach.
90s
Uh,
Bulls,
yeah, '90s Bulls. That's a good example because I think what did they win 6 and 8?
6 and 8 years. Yeah.
And honestly, they probably would have won
They
six and
probably would have
six.
they probably would have won 8 and 8 years if Jordan didn't leave.
Yeah, that's a big what if though, because does Jordan break down if
That's
he
true.
plays
Yeah.
another
He
two
probably
full
needed the
seasons?
break.
And the last thing I'll say about the Packers is there was enormous amount of pressure on the Packers to win those Super Bowls. Like that was not a win-win proposition for them. If they lose, the NFL is basically embarrassed. So they have to go out and like the pressure's all on them and the AFL is kind of in a proving ground, right? Like they have everything to gain. I don't think the Packers had anything to gain from playing the Super Bowls. They had everything to lose.
Well, even
Um,
to go back to what we were talking about earlier when we mentioned in 1969 how the Jets won the Super Bowl over the Colts. It kind of goes to show you that as soon as the Lombardi Packers run was over, like it was pretty evident that the AFL was not that far behind the NFL. So
yes.
like, it's not like they were like when the Packers were winning those 2 Super Bowls, it was like, yeah, but they're beating minor league teams. Essentially, it was what people thought.
Yep.
Like they were second-class citizens. Well, the next 2 seasons, the Super Bowl was won by AFL teams.
Yep.
So clearly, Green Bay, like those Lombardi Packers, were that far ahead of not just the AFL, but the NFL as well.
They were in a league of their own in the 1960s.
Truly.
So the other thing about Lombardi that I think, you know, we can say this about some of the best coaches of all time. Like we can say it about Belichick. We can say it about Bill Walsh, Jimmy Johnson. And then he's not one of the best coaches of all times, but these dynasties, they're actually Chuck Noll with the Steelers. They're they're brought up from the ashes. So they come in, they completely revamp their entire organization from a losing culture and a losing franchise to one that dominates the league. And he's kind of the first, I would say, like semi-modern, because the modern era in football is not considered until after the merger.
Mm-hmm.
But he's kind of setting the blueprint for
For how it's
how
done.
how it's done and how we look at dynasties, now. We might get one with the Chiefs, so we might be able to add one to that list. Um, his the other thing, the other legacy Lombardi has is he probably keeps the team in Green Bay itself because they were so bad in the 50s. There was financial concern around them. There were owners around the league that were so concerned about the sustainability of the Packers. They were they were such a poor team. Uh, they didn't have a traditional ownership structure. I think if he doesn't come and revive that situation to at least become competitive, the Packers probably don't exist.
We're not
And
here today.
yeah, they're not. Yeah, I'm not a Packers fan. I'm probably who knows because like you can't
You
even
yeah,
write football history
no,
without the
you
Packers
can't.
of the 1960s.
No.
Like they're such a foundational part of the game's history. That's like saying, that's like saying to a fan, that's like saying, what would football be like without the 80s 49ers? Well, I mean, the game blew
Yeah,
up in popularity because they were so
exactly.
fun. Like
Right.
they were,
Yeah, it's impossible to even quantify the the changes that would have happened had that not occurred, had that team not been there.
yeah. I mean, it got to the point though in the 50s, it was so bad. I mean, you had you had guys around the league, including George Hallis, who were concerned. They all, I think they were almost pushing to get Lombardi to Green Bay or somebody that could or kind of maintain
Some
some type
credibility.
of cultural, yeah, bring credibility back to the league because I think Green Bay was almost bringing them down.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they were starting like, the first 20, 30 years of the league, they were a barnstorming league. Like it was not uncommon for kind of a small industrial town. Well, not a small industrial town, but an industrial town, not some big much metropolitan to have a football team. But as they were getting towards the mid to late 50s, the early 60s, like the Portsmouth Spartans, you know, Portsmouth couldn't support a football team. Canton couldn't support an NFL team.
No,
Rochester couldn't support an NFL team. And so Green Bay was looking like, I don't know about these guys.
yeah, I mean Green Bay is really the last kind of um the last piece of history or I guess the last sign of the old NFL
Yeah.
where these small industrial towns in the Midwest, like you mentioned. I mean, what is it,
Hell,
Decatur?
the Bears got out of Decatur after the second year.
Yeah.
Like they knew that they had to go to Chicago if they wanted to survive.
Yeah, you had the Green Bay is basically the last sign of the old NFL. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a weird story because they were able to survive, but it's because these kind of fluky things happen. And one of those fluky things to happen is landing arguably the greatest coach of all time and having him almost fall in your lap when you need it
Yeah.
most. Because the Packers were winning championships in the 30s. Like they were fine,
Yeah.
but by the 1950s the game had evolved past, you know, where it was in the 30s where it was kind of the secondary game. Like the college game was considered superior to the pro game at that
Yeah.
point. And by the 50s that was changing and you had to evolve or die. And, you look around American economics with small businesses, most die.
Yeah.
Like the big market's going to win almost every time,
Yeah.
or
They
the
absorb
bigger
it.
company's going to win. And this small team didn't. And I think Vince Lombardi's greatness was probably the only thing that really saved them from that. And then it took another fluke thing happening in the 90s for Green Bay to save itself again. And that could be its own episode too, because when
Yeah.
Brett Favre and Mike Holmgren show up in Green Bay, that completely kind of brought them
There's
from
a
the
point
action
I
again.
want to make about that later too, but we'll get to that part.
Yeah. But despite Lombardi's great success, there was a lot of burden in this. So, Lombardi's career was actually short and it started late. Um, the man himself, he was almost obsessively competitive to a point where I think he hated losing more than he enjoyed winning. And he was almost unhealthy about it. And
Yeah.
I think that could have led to some health problems later in life. Um, he did take over as coach in 59 at age 45, so that's really late already. So by the 1968 season, which was I guess his last year in Green Bay as GM, his last season in Green Bay as coach was 1967. He was in his mid 50s already, which was pretty late in your career at that point. Like you weren't seeing so many guys coach into their 70s. Like I think Hallis had retired and I think was in his maybe early 60s, mid 60s.
He was born in 1898, so he would have been in his mid 60s, yeah.
Yeah, and that was
But he
and
was
he had already
ancient.
and he had retired already
Yeah.
and then came out of retirement to coach again in the
Yeah, and he
60s.
also he missed time because he went to fight on the Pacific Front too.
Yeah, so you had those type of situations
Could
where
you imagine like like Kyle Shanahan next year? They're like, actually, he's gonna go to Israel and help.
yeah, let's pray to
Like,
God that doesn't. Yeah,
no, yeah, we would hope, but like a coach leaving in the middle of the season to go, or not in the, I don't think it was in the
yeah,
middle of the season, but like to go to war.
yeah. I mean, you had that all. I mean, Ted Williams, who was the
Yeah.
biggest star in sports
Yeah.
had to
Ted
serve. I mean,
Williams.
and I mean that gives you perspective though, because like the conflicts at the time was bigger than any
They were
cultural
bigger than
phenomenon.
sports. Yeah.
Yeah, it was bigger than anything
You
cultural
you
in the
needed
United
your
States.
best men
Yeah,
over there.
yeah, you had something to. There was such a power in the world that we had to eradicate with the
Yeah.
Nazis that it took everything we had as a country, and I think it showed. I think like World War II brought a culture that kind of lingered past and almost into the 60s, and it kind of changed into the 60s.
Yeah.
But Lombardi was kind of that, he didn't serve, I think, or anything. Like he wasn't an officer. He did, I mean, he was at West Point as a coach, but that kind of military attitude to sports. And that was very common back then, but like everything was more focused on discipline and, you know, just doing your job because that's critical in a military setting. You don't want guys going rogue uh, when it comes to fighting wars. And even Teddy Roosevelt, back when he saved the game when they were first trying to outlaw it, like he said that football at its core was a way for young men to kind of learn team building and to kind of train themselves for combat, which, you know, I think in the 1950s, that viewpoint was probably a little bit more accepted. I don't think people look at the game at all like that now, and I'm not
No.
saying they should,
Yeah.
but that's kind of the way it was. And Lombardi was in a kind of a period between that philosophy and where we are now. Uh, but he ends up stepping down from the head coaching spot in 1968 and gives the job to Phil Bingston, his longtime defensive coordinator. Continues the role as GM through 1968. But the Packers slide. So they go from winning Super Bowl two, finishing off a dynasty, to a losing record. They're 6-7-1. Uh, I think that had a lot to do with Lombardi leaving. I think you have 8 Hall of Famers that were drafted, more than that, because you had some players drafted later, like Herb Adderley. So you have, nearly a dozen Hall of Fame players. You have a team that's aging. Basically, these
Yeah.
guys that were drafted in the 50s, like they're all getting up there in age, and guys didn't play as long back there.
Yeah,
Back
and
then.
they had rough training camps with
Yeah.
Lombardi, and they were
Yeah.
playing late in the year all the time. So
So, and like
makes
in the
sense.
50, for example, like, we talk about the 58 draft, those guys were what, 22, 23 when they get drafted. In
Yeah.
1968, they're 10 years in to these guys are 33, 34 years old by then. They obviously, I think they lost something with Jack Venisi when he died. I think the ability to bring in top end players, it didn't go away. Lombardi obviously had an eye for talent, but you weren't bringing in Hall of Famers like the 1958 class was never going to happen again. Like they hit the
Yeah.
jackpot. You're not going to hit that twice. So I think the team was getting worse naturally. It wasn't supposed to stay that good forever. But some other things happened. Um, his wife was struggling. His
Yeah.
kids were grown. He's a man of the East Coast, and his wife was, and I think they wanted to go back. And I think that was one of the main reasons, and there were some other reasons
Hmm.
because money always plays a factor.
Yeah.
Uh, so he goes to the Redskins. So the Redskins through the 1960s, just like the 50s Packers, one of the worst teams in the NFL. They're one of the most underwhelming teams of the decade. Their last winning record, so we're placing ourselves in 1969 now, right? Their last winning record was in 1955.
Oof.
So that's
That's even
that's
worse than Green Bay
14,
was.
14 straight losing seasons. Like in today's league, who's come close to that many in a row? Was
Uh,
Detroit? No, but
no,
Detroit,
not
Detroit, he made the playoffs in the late 90s and then got back in 2011.
yeah. Which I mean, it was some barren years, but and even
Cleveland, yeah, Cleveland made a playoffs. They made the playoffs in
oh
02.
two, they
I
were
think it
ten
was
and six and
Cleveland.
oh seven.
Oh no, they went 10-6 in '07, and
And
then
then
they
they
got
didn't
back.
have a winning record. Oh, maybe
It might have been
they didn't
Cleveland.
have it until 2020,
Yeah, but they didn't even
so
go 14, or they didn't go as long. I guess it was the same amount.
so
So,
just about, yeah, or a year less.
but it shows you this team was basically the
Yeah,
Browns. Like they had a lot of dysfunction. They had a racist owner up until Lombardi got there. Was it George Preston Marshall? I don't have it written down.
yes, yeah,
Yeah, but they had a lot of dysfunction. They were kind of the laughing stock of the league. And I think there was some pressure from the league. Like they wanted to be relevant in the nation's capital. You had a president in office by that point that took a great interest in sports. Nixon cared a lot about going to football games. He loved providing his opinion on the
yeah.
game. And the Redskins were obviously going to be a topic of conversation with the powerful people in Washington. I think Rozelle cared about that.
Yeah, I never even kind of thought about that connection, but considering the tumultuous time of that the country
Yeah.
was in at that point, like
Yeah.
you could see why they would want the Redskins to be good.
So I think there was a lot of pressure from powerful people, and I think Rozelle was happy to see Lombardi go to the Redskins, which is I think he helped make it easier for him to get out of his contract with the Packers. Not that the Packers necessarily made it difficult for him to leave. I think yeah, I think they were grateful enough for what he had done and understood there were some other issues like family issues in terms of Lombardi wanting to go back to the East Coast. Um, but the other thing is his tenure in Green Bay felt kind of short, and it's kind of crazy how similar it was to Mike Holmgren's, because Mike Holmgren was only there for less than a decade, but kind of went through the same, not to the as great of a degree, but the '90s Packers went from kind of a laughing stock in the '80s, like they weren't relevant, and then they get Favre and Holmgren, and then they're winning a Super Bowl in '96.
Yeah.
So, a very similar turnaround, but it wears off quickly, I guess. I think the town itself and maybe the environment of Green Bay, where it's only about football all the time, wears on people. So maybe that's why they can't necessarily maintain coaches. But like the more I thought about it, I should know this off the top of my head, but I guess Mike McCarthy, is he the longest tenured coach in team history? Outside of, I guess, Curly Lambeau.
Curly Lambeau, you would
Yeah.
think.
Like in the modern era of football, where like
Oh
guys
yeah,
didn't just
certainly.
coach teams for 20 years like George Hallis did or something like
Now
that.
Green Bay, like they weren't quick to move off of. Honestly, the only coach they were quick to move off of was Ray Rhodes.
Yeah.
Um, and but like I mean, Bart Starr was there probably long after he should have been gone. Forrest Gregg stayed on probably a little bit too long. Um, Lindy Infante would have been the next coach.
Yeah, I think so. And then they had a couple in there. They had Bart Starr
Oh,
was there for about 8, 9 years.
yeah, it's the
Lindy
late
Infante
seven.
was, yeah,
He was the
Forrest
late
Gregg,
80s, wasn't he?
who who
Infante,
Infante was like mid to late 80s. Forrest Gregg was like the early 80s. No, Forrest
mid
Gregg I think was
80s,
mid 80s.
because he was in
Bart Starr was
Cincinnati.
yeah, Bart Starr was late 70s or early 80s. So, uh and Starr, that kind of hurt his reputation, and that's one of
Oh,
kind of
it
the
did.
tragic events of him being a coach is like there was some animosity towards him from the fan base at that time, which sucks because Bart Starr is such a legendary quarterback and from what all accounts a legendary person. You know, and it always kind of sucks that like something like that didn't work out, but that's the risk that being a coach, ends up taking. There's a lot of pressure to win, even in a small market like that. Uh, the other, you brought up the '99 season. I know this is off, like completely off topic, but you know what sucks in history about that though, specifically about the '99 Packers, is they hire Ray Rhodes. Do you know who they really passed on?
Would have been Belichick.
I think it was Andy Reid that they passed on.
Yeah, because he would have ended up in.
because I think Andy Reid went to Philly in '99.
Philly.
That was his
Yeah.
first season. And if you were going to move off Mike Holmgren after
You
the
had
'98
somebody
season,
waiting.
you literally had a guy on the staff that was ready to go.
Who would have been so
He
good
was
with
your
Favre?
yeah, he was your assistant head coach in '98.
Is
Like,
is Andy Reid going for his ninth Super Bowl as Packers coach if he did on
yeah,
Sunday?
I mean, Andy Reid, that's probably Ron Wolf's worst moment as GM of the
Yeah.
Packers. And I think that's why he moved so quickly off of Ray Rhodes. I think he realized what he had done and he made a mistake. But then the mistakes, compounded because once he leaves, Mike Sherman becomes the GM. And then, like,
Yeah.
God, that was awful. Like, Mike Sherman, good coach, terrible GM. But back on topic, because I want to stay on Lombardi going to the Redskins.
Yeah.
He wanted a new challenge. He had won 5 championships in his 9 seasons with the Packers. So I think he wanted to kind of turn it around. But obviously, the elephant in the room, there's a less romantic angle to this, and you're naive if you don't think this is an angle. I mean, it's financial. Like, he was
Yeah.
going to benefit financial, and I don't blame him for that, by the way.
Yeah. Go get your bag, as I say.
Yeah. Oh God, I hate that phrase so much. And he's going to get the bag. And I'm like, what is the what?
Whose
Man,
bag?
whose bag? Like, because when you take a bag of money, it's like you're robbing the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
I guess.
anyway, the less romantic angle of that is that it was simply a financial decision for him to leave Green Bay for the Redskins. His contract prevented him from coaching another team until after the 1973 season, but the Redskins were able to offer him something the Packers couldn't, and that was 5% equity of the team. Green Bay is, you can buy stock in the team, but it's worthless stock.
Yeah.
You can't sell it. It doesn't pay a dividend because it's a nonprofit organization. It's basically a fundraising arm for the team. It's the fans. The fans want to pay for a piece of paper to keep the Packers competitive. Now, I think it's charming. I think it's cool.
Yeah. It's cute.
And as long as they're not raising taxes on the people there that don't care about football, I'm all for that model. I wish
Yeah.
that was more common across all professional sports, because the one thing I can't stand reading is when some guy worth $200 billion, or not that much, but like a guy worth $50 billion
Yeah. Yeah.
wants you to pay more of your property
He,
tax.
he
Like, he
wants to
wants
know will the school district give up some of the money for
yeah.
his new
Or like,
stadium?
yeah, like I don't like if I lived in Mecklenburg County, and that's Charlotte, and I saw David Tepper wanted to like take a portion of my already high property taxes and pour it into Bank of America Stadium 2.0. Like,
Yeah, you'd
go F
revolt.
yourself, dude. Go
Yeah,
F yourself. Like, because am I getting a piece of the Panthers, or is the city of Charlotte getting that? And they're like, no, what we're going to be able to do is bring concerts to the area.
yeah, my ass. I
Yeah.
couldn't give a shit.
Yeah, I could give a crap. At least with this model, I like it because it's ultimately like the fans that care about it, they pay for it.
Yeah,
But the Redskins are able to do something the Packers can't. That's give equity in the team. He also got a pretty nice salary from the Redskins. And like I said earlier, the Packers don't necessarily put up a huge fight. I think it was just time to move on for everybody. Packers kind of go into a depression after that, and they're not relevant for 20 years. So in '69, so we're at the present day now. Lombardi immediately turns them around. Breaking news. In his first season, 7-5-2, which is very close to his 7-5 record in 1958 with the Packers.
oh wow.
So
eerie.
he comes in, immediately wins, has a winning season. And so immediately turns around. They have a culture that they're building. This team went 5-8 under Otto Graham in '68. That was a 14-year losing streak or a losing season streak that they had. He comes in, wipes the slate clean. Everybody's excited about this 1970 team. Uh, Sonny Jurgensen, he continued his path forward. Underrated career, by the way.
Yeah.
Kind of sad that he played on so many crap teams for the first part of his career. But he was one of the best pure passers of the dead ball era.
Mm-hmm.
And the note I want to share with you on the 1969 Redskins is, yeah, they lost 5 games. They lost all 5 games to teams with winning records. But these teams weren't just teams with winning records. They lost to the Colts, who were in their final year with Shula. So he lost to Don Shula with Johnny Unitas at quarterback.
Not bad.
That team won the Super Bowl the following season.
Yeah, they did.
With Eubank. The Cowboys won the Capital Division. They actually played them twice and lost twice.
Okay.
Cowboys went 11-2, 11-2-1 under Tom Landry. And they won the newly formed NFC the following season, and they lost to the Colts in Super Bowl V. The Browns lost in the last NFL championship game ever played. Who did they lose to?
In 69,
Yes.
they would have lost to the Vikings.
The Vikings did win a championship. They did. Hey, on the Old Souls Football Podcast, NFL championships count.
Hold on. That's like an NFC championship, though, because after the Super Bowl,
I did, yeah, because once the Super Bowl happened, like everybody's kind of like, well, wait a second. That's always an interesting debate because, like, a Vikings fan would probably tell you, well, I mean, we did win the '69 championship. Well, that's not a very good Minnesota accent.
Yeah, we did win this. I would have to think about how I want to make
oh,
this.
Geez. Oh, geez. We did win the
We
1969
did.
championship.
You basically got to sound like the people in Fargo.
Yeah. I love in like Fargo, they're like committing murders, and like you just hear like, oh geez, oh geez, oh no, I'm sorry,
Red, Red.
Yeah,
Great
like,
movie. I love that movie.
Have you seen the show?
One time I was like flipping through the channels and I just happened upon it, and it was a really interesting episode, but like I had no idea about the context of anything. So
yeah, it's on Hulu. It's pretty good. I highly recommend it.
My wife does have that. I might try it sometime.
Yeah. Yep. And then the Rams were the last team. So the Browns lost the NFL championship, and the Rams, they won the Coastal Division and won the playoff bowl, which was actually the third place game.
And Lombardi, didn't he decline playing in that one time? Or did they? Yeah, I think or maybe he did, but he was so pissed off about it or something.
Yeah, I can't remember, honestly.
Yeah, something similar to that. I don't know.
But 1970 looked promising for the Redskins. But unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. Lombardi dies in the summer of 1970. He had health issues dating back to 67. But in June of 1970, doctors discovered colon cancer. He passed away 3 months later, just 2 weeks before the NFL season kicks off. And the crazy thing about his death and like the timing of it is that was the first season where the old AFL and the old NFL merged into the new NFL, right? Like it
was like a passing of the torch almost.
He literally dies 2 weeks before
the merger,
what we considered the merger, and the merger is considered kind of the modern era of football. Because a lot of the times, like when you hear guys say, like, since the merger, this is the stat.
Yeah.
When Lombardi passed, it was basically like pro football was completely changed.
Yeah.
Once he passed. And like Lombardi was kind of the last figurehead of the old era. And like once he left the game, unfortunately, he left the game when he had passed. We obviously wished he would have been able to just retire and see the passing of the torch that way. But once he left the game started to change.
Yeah.
And that leads to some burning questions. And I want you to kind of go into some detail because I know you've thought a lot about this.
Yeah.
So he dies at 57. Only coached 10 seasons. So really not much of a sample size.
No.
A great sample size though. Best record or winning percentage of all time, basically postseason record that won't be touched. What happens if he coaches another 10?
Um, Assuming he's still with the Redskins, I do think now winning Super Bowls. See, now this is the hard part because it sounds like, some people, oh, are you attacking a legend? I don't see it like that, but I don't see him maybe winning. Maybe he wins another Super Bowl, maybe he wins two. But the NFC at that time, or what was about to become the NFC just before he passed, or just after he passed, I should say,
Yeah.
was very weak. Well, not very weak, but it was open. The Cowboys were starting to get very good, so the Redskins were always going to be battling them in the East.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think this is when it was the three divisions and one wild card, right?
Yes.
So he definitely could have gotten maybe a couple wild cards out of that. But like the Vikings were making Super Bowls. The Vikings made three Super Bowls after he passed in the 70s. They took advantage of down years. Like the Rams were a very good team in the West, but they weren't Super Bowl. Actually, the year that they were kind of down, they ended up making it anyways, late in the decade. I think he definitely does get there, but the problem is, I keep talking about the NFC. The AFC had some dogs in it. The arguably the three best teams of the decade. Now, the Cowboys would have a claim to this, but the
Yes.
three best teams of the decade were the Steelers, the Dolphins, and the Raiders.
Yeah.
And um, now in 1972, the Redskins did make a Super Bowl, and they ran into the Dolphins.
72 Dolphins. Yeah.
Now that would have been really interesting. That would have really cemented something for Lombardi if he took down an undefeated team in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Now, but also they were favored. The NFC was favored that time. Do they cash in with Lombardi? Who's to know? Um, I don't see him beating any of the Steelers teams. And he, I think it might, um, it's very difficult to know. As we always say, it's just like we said, what would have happened if Green Bay wasn't there, or if he didn't go to Green Bay in 1959, what would have happened
Yeah.
to the NFL? But um, I think we didn't see enough of, the Packer sweep was so vital to what Green Bay did. I think we didn't see enough of, and maybe in years' time, there's game footage that comes available, but
Mm-hmm.
of his passing game, even though the 70s, if the 60s were the dead ball, the 70s was an incredibly awful time for offense in the NFL. He might
Yeah.
have done well with a good running game, but he had Billy Kilmer at quarterback not long after Sonny Jurgensen left, or he would have had.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a Super Bowl winning quarterback.
Now, I think speaking of Jurgensen though, I
He
think
might
he
have stuck
becomes
on.
I think he could have stuck on towards the end of his career and I think we would have looked differently. I mean, he's still a Pro Football Hall of Famer, so I mean,
Yeah.
still a gold jacket player, but I think you could look at him more like we look at, somebody like Roger Staubach or something
Yeah.
like that, where like you win a championship. And remember, Jurgensen was considered one of the best passers of his era. So you start to look at him differently, I think. But the thing Jurgensen never had was he was never really a winner. And
Yeah.
I think that was missing from his resume. Um, I agree with you. The AFC was really the class of the 70s. I mean, you had Miami, obviously, with Shula and the Dolphins, Larry Zonka, Bob Greasy, those guys, Mercury Morris, the no-name defense. Pittsburgh speaks for itself. I mean,
Yes. Steel
dynasty of
curtain.
the decade. Oakland with Madden,
Jimmy
those teams were,
Stabler.
yeah, those teams were formidable. Uh, and then, I mean, Dallas was a machine. I mean, they literally called it the machine, where they were one of the first franchises to kind of follow the Paul Brown method of building an organization out, where
They
they had a scouting system under Gil Brandt that
mhm,
basically built one of the best rosters and the best and most sustainable levels of football. And that's why Landry was able to be so good for so long with the Cowboys,
yeah.
where so you're dealing with that. I think it's a way more competitive NFL for Lombardi.
Yeah.
Now, I think he competes in that. I don't
Yes.
think he dominates it like he did with the Packers. And I think the problem for him is you can only go down from where you were.
Exactly.
I don't think
It's
we
a
look at
similar,
Lombardi.
yeah.
Yeah. We look at him kind of like what Belichick's going through right
Yeah, I was
now.
just about to say that. Yeah.
Belichick's the type of coach. If you take out the 2020, the 2022, and the 2023 seasons, and you just look at his resume with the 1 year he had in Mac Jones in 21, that was actually pretty good. If you'd look at Bill Belichick and his Patriots resume for a 20-year period, it's dominant.
Mm,
I
yeah.
mean, it speaks for itself. 6 Super Bowls, but it's amazing how 3 poor years can hurt your reputation. He didn't even get a job
Yeah.
in this hiring cycle, and people are gonna knock him for that. We saw it with George Seifert, won 2 Super Bowls with the 49ers. His reputation was ruined when he after he went to Carolina, and he's not in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
How is George Seifert not in the Hall of
Yeah.
Fame? He had some of the most dominant teams of all time.
He did.
He was part of the Niners machine,
And
but all
he
because he had
still
Chris Winkie at
had
quarterback.
Mike Shanahan as an offensive coordinator who grew the Shanahan tree. The Shanahan tree started technically post Bill Walsh, San Francisco.
You can't have Mike Shanahan and all of these offensive geniuses that have come without the success of George Seifert.
Yeah.
He's one of the we could go into this next week where we have all
Yeah.
these guys that have been left out, but
Yeah.
I left out of Hall of Fame discussions, but like George Seifert's one of them. But I don't think we look at Lombardi the same way. Where
I
and I
think his
and I,
best chance would have been the early 70s. But by
er,
the mid 70s, it would have been
yeah,
too far
Pitts,
gone.
yeah, Pittsburgh and Oakland especially were just so full of talent
Yeah.
at that point. Where I think it's just it would have been too much.
And
I don't even
it was a meaner league too. You know, like
yeah.
not that Lombardi's teams weren't tough, but I don't know if they like the things that
Well,
that
yeah, they're not.
Pittsburgh
It wasn't a
did.
dirty league.
They yeah, he wasn't
Yeah,
dirty. I can't imagine like
you didn't have
Lombardi.
You didn't have like Willie Wood wasn't out there throwing his elbow into a guy's throat like
Lombardi
some of the
wasn't
Raiders did.
watering the field at nighttime so that it would freeze.
Yeah,
You know, those kind of or watering the field in sunny Oakland as if it poured rain for two
yeah,
weeks on end. Like that wasn't an and that's fun. That's gamesmanship. I
yeah,
do appreciate those stories. But that wasn't Lombardi. And I think he might have even seen himself um uh, you know kind of drifting away from the
yeah.
rest of the community of coaches at that time, and he might have just even himself said, yeah, this isn't my cup of tea anymore.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think the other thing that kind of states our case on that is if you actually look at the coaching tree that he had, um, one of the things that he doesn't really have is none of his assistants were really great head coaches, and that's a
Hmm.
sign that I think his approach doesn't necessarily age well
Yes.
with the
Not
70s and the
replicated.
80s. It didn't. No one was able to replicate it, and I think that shows the number one, the mastery of what he was able to do when in Green Bay with the persona, the leadership, um, just the cultural impact he had on one team. I think that speaks for itself in terms of, I mean, he should be considered like the Mount Rushmore of coaches. Like he's up there with he's one of the first you think of. The trophy's named after him, for God's sake. But you look at his coaching tree, it's not great. Bill Austin from 66 to 68 with the Steelers. The Steelers were terrible. He had and then he coached the Redskins in 1970, was quickly let go. They hired George Allen. Norm Hecker with the Falcons. The Falcons were not competitive in the 1960s. Tom Fears with the Saints in the 60s, same thing. Which, in a way, I don't know if that's super fair to those two guys because
Yeah, they were
coaching two
joining
expansion
expansion teams.
and expansion teams back then, it wasn't fair. Like
Yeah,
you can't build a team.
scrap heap guys.
Yeah. In the 90s, you had Dom Capers and Tom Coughlin leading expansion teams 2 years in to championship games. That
Right.
wasn't going to happen in the 60s. Forrest Gregg actually did have some success with the Bengals, but with the Browns and the Packers, he didn't see much. And then Bart Starr, we mentioned earlier, his coaching career busted. So really, Lombardi's tree was not awesome.
No.
And it shows you his approach and his I guess his style didn't necessarily translate as the game evolved into the 70s. Uh how do we remember him? I mean, do we declare him the greatest coach of all time? Is my first question.
Um,
I don't think you can. I don't think it's out of the
yeah.
question, but I think it's a debate.
It's yeah, it definitely the debate door does open if he does coach for a few more years. Part of what made Lombardi so um there was literally a thing called the Lombardi mystique. You know, like everybody
Yeah.
can think of that one NFL film like it was it an
Lombardi.
episode Lombard John Facenda Lombardi. There's a certain magic even in the name or something like that. You know, like but like it was true. Like we didn't see, you know, really like Lombardi is almost like a Paul Bunyan figure in some way. Like you just hear like tales about him and you see like little clips of his, you know, what the hell's going on out there? Like, you know,
Yeah.
on the sideline and things like that. Um, he was he truly was a pre-modern era coach. And he was, you know, for us, he was just at the time that our grandparents were getting into football. Maybe our parents, you know, or aunts and uncles were watching football for the first time. But they were little kids when they were doing that. It's not like they were teenagers or,
Yeah.
you know, for some of our listeners, they might have been younger kids. So he was like, it was like a kind of he was a folk hero is truly what he was. If he continues to coach, you know, it's almost a blessing in one way that he didn't, because who knows if we would have remembered him like this. And as we said, he had more to lose than to gain at that point.
I agree with you. I think with Lombardi, it's like I thought about this. It's you can't really go find a like live TV clip of him, like a broadcast TV clip, right? You
Yeah.
try and go back and watch like Super Bowl one, like everybody's looking for that tape.
They do say there is one guy that has like the NBC
Yeah,
tape.
but apparently you just can't find it. So these these games from like they were filmed because Steve and Ed Sable with NFL Films were able to start in the 60s, like so they have clips of these games, but they're
Yeah.
cinematic. They
Yes.
they they feel more like a Hollywood movie than they do you watching a game and you remember, oh, I remember watching that game on TV. You don't remember
Mhm.
Lombardi. It feels like from years gone by, like you're watching old war clips
Yeah.
or and
Like it
it
doesn't
doesn't
feel like it was the 1960s.
yeah, it feels older. And I think it sort of gives you this, like, you're going into a time capsule, and that all changed right after he dies. Like in 1970, with the merger, TV. I mean, I even mentioned the moon landing for a reason. Live television changed basically right as Lombardi got to the Redskins, and very soon after he died, where live TV takes over the sports landscape. It becomes really the best programming any net like
Yeah.
and look at it today. It is the
Monday Night Football
centerpiece.
started that the same year, right?
Yeah. Monday Night Football started. Television completely changes the sport, and Lombardi's not there for that. He just missed out on that. So his legacy ends right as the game changed. So he feels from a, a previous era altogether, but he was so close to actually being able to coach again. Like he could have easily been coaching against the
Yeah.
72 Dolphins. He could have easily been coaching against Tom Landry. If he coaches another, what age did he die? It was like 58, I
50,
said, I think.
yeah, 57, 58 around there. He's a
Let's say
young man.
if he coaches 10 more seasons, let's say he coaches into his late 60s, which we see all the time now. Like that's about retire. Belichick's like 72, 73 now.
I think Matt
Um,
Eberflus is 57 himself right now.
yeah. And he's a new coach.
Yeah.
So you have all of these guys, like if all these guys coaching late into their life now, but that wasn't normal back then. But let's say Lombardi coaches another 10 seasons. That would get him to 1980. In 1980, Montana's in the league at that
Yeah.
point. Like Montana played up until what? Like 94, I think.
Yeah.
95 maybe. So like
Yeah,
you have
you're starting to do the thing like where wait, he coached this guy who ended up playing with this guy who's played with this guy whose career ended in 2006 or something
yeah.
like that.
I mean his paths would have crossed with Dick Vermeil at that
Yeah.
point. He would have coached like if he's coaching the Redskins in 1980, Dick Vermeil's
He
coaching
would
the Eagles.
he
Dick
would have
Vermeil
been
coached in the
coaching
2000s.
he would have been coaching across the sideline from Bill Belichick.
Yeah.
Because
Eh,
Belichick was at the Colts in 1975.
Yeah.
And
On the flip
Belichick was on a sideline 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. On the flip side, it can end disastrously. Like I
Yeah.
think some coaches we saw it, like Tom Landry, for example, like because you had the fedora hat and like the
Mm-hmm.
shadow of Texas Stadium, like he
Yeah.
had that aura. That was the 70s, man. That was like NFC football in the 70s. You think of the
Yeah.
purple people
Classy.
eaters.
Yeah.
You think of the like,
The
and that's the other.
doomsday defense.
Yeah, you think of all these like you think of the Cowboys, right?
Yeah.
In the early 90s, the Cowboys sucked. And
Mm-hmm.
that all changed. Like Jerry Jones fired him. And then like his legacy like really got hurt by that. We just saw with Belichick. Sometimes these guys stay too long. And obviously, like it was tragic that he died. In a way, his career in football ended at the perfect time. I
Yeah.
think.
You know, like even like all the times, like the last couple of years, speaking of player wise, like when Brady won like in 2020 and everybody was like, dude, just retire. Like, dude, like you just that's your seventh, man. Like go out on top.
Yeah.
And he went out on an 8-9 team. He lost a Monday night playoff game, which is a travesty. I
To the
hate that
Cowboys.
to the Cowboys. So it was like, you know, you hate somebody else. It's nice when in some ways there's some autonomy about when you get to leave. And even if Vince's autonomy wasn't, you know, it might have been the good Lord saying, all right, let's save you.
Yeah, like I said, you don't want, colon cancer to be the one dictating the end of his career and the end of his
Yes.
life.
Right.
But I think the story of the 1960s, it begins and ends with Vince Lombardi.
100%.
Thank you again for listening to the Old Souls Football Podcast. Next week, Neil and I dive into the Hall of Fame class, who got snubbed, who's getting in. We make a case for each player.